All right, it's 6:32, so let's get started now. So big welcome to everybody and thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar. We hope that you'll take something useful away from this. And I guess this is the perfect night as well to do it. It's kind of wet and cold and rainy outside, so might as well be inside listening to code violations and suspension points. All right, so we are going to mainly talk about the suspension point system and what kinds of behavior and actions will result in suspension points. But before we get started, I want to tell you that this is being recorded, and we'll provide the links to you to share with others who might have not been able to make it today, but who are still interested in hearing all about this. And everybody is in listen only mode. So if you have any questions, please enter them using the chat and I will get to them at the end. I'll leave plenty of time for questions, so we will have time for that. Okay, so once again, thank you, and let's dive right into it. All right, here we go. So this is what we plan to cover today. First of all, we'll talk about player conduct because player conduct is basically underneath everything that happens with the suspension point systems or code violations. And we'll talk about what is expected of the player, and not only the player, but also persons associated with the player, their entourage, if you want to call it that. We'll talk about the purpose of the suspension point system. We'll talk about how the penalty point system is used. We'll also say something about officials. Most of our junior tournaments have officials at them. We'll tell you what you can expect from the officials. And then we'll give you some tips about avoiding penalties. What can you do so you don't get penalized, so that you don't get suspension points? And then I'll open it up for questions. Okay, so that's basically what we'll cover today, and we should have plenty of time to go to your questions as well. So what is expected? Player conduct. Let's talk about what is expected of the player. Now, this is laid out in USTA Regulation 4, and for those of you who know about Friend at Court, it is about 15 pages in the Friend at Court that talks just about player responsibilities and conduct. For those of you who don't know, you should get a copy of Friend at Court, or you can access it online. It's available. So uh, go to it and read through it. I think it's quite interesting to see all the kinds of things that are listed there. So under Regulation 4C, there's specific things about standards of conduct. And I'm only highlighting a few over here, which I think are important, but there's a whole list of them. So I encourage you once again to go and look at that and read it. So what are the things that stand out? So first of all, we look for maintaining high standards of conduct, fair play, and good sportsmanship. No unsportsmanlike conduct of player, but more importantly, any person associated with the player as well, because that could result in suspension points for the player. Not entering two overlapping tournaments at the same time when entries close. So you have two tournaments that you think you might enter, and you enter both of them. But when entries close, you should be in only one of them. You should not be entered in both. And this is something that's a bit of a pet peeve for me because I see these back draws of tournaments where there's a consolation draw and you see people dropping like flies in the consolation draw. And if you just look at it, it's quite unlikely that so many people are having illnesses or injuries or personal circumstances that prevent them from playing in the back draw. And the main thing is any withdrawals should be for illness, injury, or personal circumstances. So you should not be withdrawing for any other reasons. And finally, this is, like I said, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is a list of things that I thought were important to highlight over here. And no coaching. So especially for parents, I think this is kind of hard. However much you want to say, go to his backhand, serve wide, go to the net, or whatever it is, it should not be done when you're child is playing a match. Okay. All right, so let's go on. So now that we know some of the conduct that is expected from the player, let's talk about the suspension point system itself. So what is the suspension point system? This is a system under which players are assessed points for unsportsmanlike behavior in USTA sanctioned sectional and national tournaments, as well as ITF tournaments. So a player who accumulates too many points is suspended, so they can't play anymore. Let's see where it applies. So it's in all sanctioned tournaments, like I said, all USTA sanctioned tournaments and ITF, but there is an exception for the net gen red ball and for net gen orange, green, and yellow ball. It's not authorized in NorCal. Some sections have been given the latitude to actually use it in some of those as well, but NorCal does not. Any other sanctioned tournament, it is in use. It applies to all matches, the main draw, compass draw, consolation, qualifying, doubles, anything you're playing in, it does apply. During all tournament activities, so if they're having a player get together before the tournament starts, they're going to do a briefing. The code of conduct actually applies there as well. And if something is breached, some violation of the conduct occurs, you could get suspension points for behavior at that time during a pre-event activity. All forms of communication. So you could be doing something online and either harassing or doing something threatening to the other player or players, and that could result in suspension points. Places where you're staying, hotels, dorms, homes. Sometimes when players are playing in other places, they're hosted at people's houses. Even there, it applies. So your behavior is crucial even in those places. Now let's look at table 17. Table 17 is actually in the friend at court, and it lays out all the different things that you could get a suspension point for and how many suspension points you could actually receive. I'll talk more about code violations later, but each code violation that you could get would result in 2 suspension points in addition to whatever penalty you pay on the court while you're playing. But look at all the other things that you could also get suspension points for. Defaults. You don't show up. You're entered in a tournament, you don't show up. You get a default for a no-show. Your opponent, who should have played you, advances, but you get 5 suspension points. You arrive late and you're defaulted past the 15-minute time. You're allowed to play in the back draw, but you still get a suspension point for that. And oops. Okay, look, failure to pay an entry fee. Sometimes there's some things that happen that there's a the system is not able to process the payment. So after the tournament, if you're approached by the tournament director and said this is still outstanding, you should pay it because failure to pay an entry fee could result in 2 suspension points. And we talked about overlapping entries, 4 suspension points. I had an issue where 2 parents started fighting outside the court where a doubles match was going on with their kids. One parent was encouraging the kid the whole time at the end of every point, he had something to say. And the other parent got very upset at that. And he just walked over and got in the other parent's face and threatened to fight him. And the kids ended up with 8 suspension points for flagrant, unsportsmanlike conduct by a person associated with the player. All right, so what exactly happens? So you get these suspension points, and then what happens? Now, the referee of the tournament will enter the suspension points within 3 days after the end of the tournament. So you get a code violation, you smashed your racket, you got a code violation for racket abuse, 2 suspension points. As soon as it is entered, you will get an email saying you got 2 suspension points. And usually there will be a reason and an explanation. And the explanation will tell you basically why you're getting those 2 suspension points. And those suspension points will show on the player profile. It's not publicly visible, but if you go into your player profile on USTA.com and you look at you click on the about, you'll see how many suspension points you have. Now, what happens if you accumulate them? You played in 3 different tournaments, and each one of them you got some things. For one of them, you didn't show at all, you got 5 suspension points. Another one, you had 2 code violations. That's 4 suspension points, one for each of the code violations. You're at 9 points now. And then in the current tournament, you've been overruled twice, and then finally you get overruled for a third time. That's a code violation for unsportsmanlike conduct, and you get 2 more points. Now you've got to 11 points, and you've gone over the 10-point threshold. Now, this 10 points is considered over a 12-month rolling period, and it results in a 3-month suspension. So at that point, when you are suspended, you are not allowed to play in any tournaments for 3 months. Following that suspension, 10 points are taken off your points, your assessed points. So now let's say the same example, you had 11 points. So you have 1 point remaining from that. Now say over the next 12 months, you accumulate another 7 points. That's 8 points total. You get another suspension. This time it's a 6-month suspension. So it's a little bit more severe. It's over the same time period, but you have to be on better behavior because it gets triggered at a lower threshold. So after serving the 6-month suspension, those 8 points will fall off, but any other points that you might have accumulated that contributed to that 6-month suspension would still stay. And then your next 12-month period, you're allowed only 6 suspension points. And if you do hit that threshold, you will get a minimum of a 12-month suspension, and it could be even longer. Now, what happens with suspensions? Once you do get suspended, you can appeal it. Now, let's say you're in a tournament and you get 2 suspension points for a code violation, and you really think that it should not have been assessed. You cannot appeal it when you just have 2 suspension points. But if you do accumulate enough to get suspended, then you can go back and say, those 2 suspension points that I had on the first one that I got, it happened for this reason, and I should not have been given that. It seemed like it was a very arbitrary assessment of those points. So at that point, you can appeal all the points that you've accumulated thus far. So that's how the suspension point system works. It's in place so that people with repeated bad behavior get penalized. All right, let's talk about the point penalty system now. Now, the point penalty system is used to, again, the purpose is to deter unsportsmanlike conduct, but it is used mainly during the matches. So it is for conduct while you are playing your match. And its purpose is to deter unsportsmanlike conduct during the match. And there's one other purpose, and that's to ensure compliance with the continuous play rule. The continuous play rule is basically the rule that says you have a certain amount of time, which is between points, and certain amount of time at the changeovers at odd games and set breaks after a set is complete. And also in the case of junior tournaments, when they're playing a match tie break, they get a 3-minute rest period. So these are all times that are defined, but violating those times violates the continuous play rule. So that's one of the reasons for the point penalty system. The other is to, again, to penalize misconduct. And let's look at those two uh, different things, the delay and the misconduct. So delay, and again, some of these things may not be applicable directly in the junior tournaments that we are typically used to, because you don't have um, officials watching it the whole time. And I'll talk a little bit more about the officials and what their responsibilities are. But delay after a medical timeout would result in a code violation. So you have a medical timeout, you take your 3 minutes, you finished with the medical timeout, and if there's an official on the court, they say time, and it takes you another minute before you can get started playing. You'll get a code violation for that, because once the official has called time, you have 30 seconds to go back and start play. So if you did take a minute to do that, you're going to be getting a code violation for delay of game. For cramping, if you're cramping, you've had a medical timeout already and you can't continue play, it takes you longer than the 25 seconds, or you're sitting down on the changeover and it takes you a minute after time has been called before you can hobble back to your end of the court and start serving, you get a code violation for that. Again, delay of game. So you take too long to between serves, you get a time violation, and then you get upset and you take longer. You just bounce the ball and you're waiting and you're looking and you're basically daring the official to do something. So another 25 seconds passes and you get a code violation after that, because you first got a time violation and you still didn't start playing in time. So you get a code violation. You break your racket, or you break a string on your racket, you don't have a replacement racket, you have to go off court to get it. Takes you 2 minutes to do that. Again, if you're going off court to get a replacement racket, you're subject to code violations for delay of game. So these are all kinds of things that would result in getting code violations for just delaying the game. Now, the other part of it is getting code violations for misconduct. And these are the things that we typically see and sometimes see on TV as well. Racket abuse. The player is so upset that they lost that game. And it's a changeover. They go to their bench, they sit down, and they smash the racket in front of them. Maybe one, two, three rackets. I've seen, I think one of the pro players smashing five of those of his rackets. So you get a code violation for racket abuse. You hit the ball out of the court because you're so upset you lost the point. Code violation for ball abuse. You say something to the official, you don't like the call, you call him a bleep, bleep, bleep. Code violation for verbal abuse. So there's a lot of things that you could do that could result in a code violation. Coaching, you're getting coaching, and I think one of the famous examples of that was Serena Williams in the US Open when she got coaching, and and it turned into a real disaster, I I would say. So that would be another reason that you could get a code violation. Okay, so let's talk about what happens when you get code violations. In the professional tournaments, players get a warning. So the first time they do something, they get a warning. Hit the ball out of their court, and there's a code violation, ball abuse, warning. There are no warnings in USTA tennis. In the tournaments that are sanctioned by USTA, we go straight to the first offense, to a point penalty. So you're serving at 15-30, you lose the point, so now the score is 15-40, and you're so upset, you take the ball and you hit it out of the court. Code violation, point penalty, game's over. Your opponent just won the game. So that's how the penalties are applied. So the first offense would be a point. You do it, you do something again, you lose a game, and and think about it this way. If you're in a set tiebreak and you've already had one code violation and you do something in the set tiebreak that causes a second code violation, game penalty, and you've lost that set. And you do it a third time and it's a default. Your opponent has just won the match. However, even though there's a progression point game default, a single unsportsmanlike act could result directly in a default. I think a lot of us have seen on TV as well, where a player has taken a ball and hit it in anger because they lost the point. And even though they didn't mean to, it has hit somebody or injured somebody. That would be an example of a single act that could result directly in a default. Now, one thing for players to know is that defaults may be appealed, but there is a certain time frame when they can be appealed. If it happened on the court and he was defaulted for something, if the player was defaulted for, let's say they hit the ball and it hit somebody, they can appeal it, but they have to do it before leaving the playing area. So you can't go back to the desk and think about it and then come back and say, I'm going to appeal that. It's too late. Or if it was not on the court, let's say it was a default for lateness, and you are stuck in traffic, your phone is dead, you can't call the tournament desk, and you can't be reached either. And you arrive there 5 minutes after the 15 minutes. You can appeal that default because you just learned about it then, but you have to do it within the next 15 minutes. So that's the time frame for appealing defaults. Now, code violations can also be appealed, and I will talk about it a bit when I talk about the officials, their roles and responsibilities. But one other thing I wanted to mention is that anytime you get a code violation, you're also getting suspension points. So the suspension point system is also getting points for every code violation. So your behavior on the court as well as off the court results in suspension points. Okay, and briefly, I wanted to talk about time violations and delays. Now, time violations don't normally trigger any suspension points. So it's the ITF rules of tennis say it's 25 seconds between points. In our tournaments, most of them, we don't have ball kids. So the 25 seconds is used as a guideline. So if they're walking with purpose, let's say there's a ball at the net, the server goes to the net, picks up the ball, goes back to the service line, baseline, and serves. And it takes them more than 25 seconds to do it. That will not be penalized. But if they're purposely taking the time, the balls are there, they go to the back fence, they stare at the fence for a while, they're doing something else, then they look for their towel, they walk over to the edge of the court, pick up their towel, wipe their face, come back, and then serve. That, if they pass 25 seconds, they're not doing it with purpose. It seems like they're purposely taking the time. That could result in a time violation. Changeovers and set breaks, 90 seconds, 120 seconds. And then there's the 3 minute rest period between after splitting sets and before the match tiebreak in junior tournaments. So these are all times. If you violate them, you get a time violation. The first time violation would be a warning. First time you do it, you get a warning. And then you do it again in the second set, you have another time violation, you get a point penalty. You do it again in the third set or in the match tiebreak, you get another point penalty. So it doesn't increase after that. It just stays at point penalties. There's one difference though in junior tournaments, if they're playing a full third set, they are given a 10-minute rest period. If they're late, up to 5 minutes after the 10-minute rest period, it's not a time violation. They actually get a game penalty. So you have 10 minutes. The official calls time at 9.5 minutes. At 10 minutes, you're still nowhere to be found. At 10 minutes and 30 seconds, you finally show up and you're ready to play. You're starting the third set, a game down. And if it took you more than 5 minutes, at 15 minutes, you're still not on the court. 16 minutes, you show up, you've just been defaulted from that match. So that default could result in code violations, but typically time violations and delays of game do not result in code violations, and so they do not result in any suspension points being assessed. All right, I'd like to talk a little bit about the roles of officials at tournaments. So there are two key officials. Now, there should be a referee at each one of the tournaments that you're playing in. Now, the different levels of tournaments go from level 7 to level 3, and level 7s are the lower ones, and level 3s are the highest ones. Now, at the level 7, they could have something called a tournament director slash referee, a joint role that they have, and they have to have been approved and certified for that. But for everything else, L6 and above, there has to be a referee for the tournament. Now, typically they're listed on the tournament page, so you know who the referee is. Now, if they're not listed, you could ask at the tournament desk who the referee is. So every level 6 or above, so level 5, level 4, level 3, would have a referee. Now, the referees and the roving umpires are responsible for following the rules and regulations, and they should be called whenever there's some issues on the court. And if it's an issue on the court, the player should be the one calling them. And the player is allowed to leave the court to find an official if there's an issue on the court that the players can't resolve between themselves. Now, if a parent watching the match thinks there's coaching going on, that may be one reason for the parent to go and find an official and say, I believe there's some coaching going on this court. But for any on-court matters, it should be the players themselves who find the official or flag down the official. And they are allowed to leave the court to find an official. So the referee and the roving officials. So every tournament, the regulations in NorCal call for one roving official or court monitor for every 4 courts that are being used at the tournament. And this is for junior tournaments. For adult tournaments, we say that it has to be one roving official or court monitor for every 8 courts. Now, there's also there should be the site referees. So if the tournament is being conducted over multiple sites, each one of the sites should have a site referee as well. Now, the site referee and the could be the same person who is also roving. So if you had a tournament where you had 6 courts at one site and 5 courts at the other, the person at the satellite site could be the site referee and the roving monitor. Sorry, and the roving official. Come. So let's talk about some of the responsibilities of the the referees. The referee supervises all aspects of play, including the conduct of players, coaches, spectators, officials that are officiating at the match, and also the administrators. Now, the referee is supposed to be present throughout the tournament, all the days of the tournament. So they should be always there. So if you have an issue as a player and you say, I want to see the referee, or you don't agree with a question of tennis law, then you can ask to see the referee and they should be there. And as I mentioned, the site referees are at secondary sites. The roving umpires are typically used to watch multiple courts. So they prepare the courts, they time the warm-ups, changeovers, set breaks. They watch matches, they'll call footfalls, they'll assess code violations. You break your racket, you smash your racket, you'll get a code violation. They help settle scoring disputes. If they're on the court, they'll overrule incorrect calls. Um, if there's any issues with spectators, they'll help control the spectators. And like I mentioned before, if there's some flagrant misconduct, they could default players. And often they're called on to resolve on-court dispute. There's something going on that the players are not sure about or they don't agree on. And the roving official can be called to resolve those. Some tournaments use court monitors as well. The court monitors do many of the things that the roving umpires do, but they do not issue code violations. So if there's some behavior that merits a code violation, they will go on the court, they will stop play, and they will call one of the officials, either the referee or one of the the roving umpires, to come and they'll describe what happened, what they witnessed, and what they heard, what they saw. And if it's conduct that deserves a code violation, then the official will then assess the code violation at that point. So at any tournament, if you don't see these officials, you should look for them. You should know that there's a referee there, and there should be one umpire for every 4 courts. Now, the referee could be one of them as well. So a place that has 8 courts, for example, they could have a referee and a roving umpire, and each of them is responsible for 4 courts. So that would satisfy that requirement to have one official for every 4 courts. And then the other important person at these tournaments is the tournament director. And this is probably the person that you have been in contact with before signing up for the tournament. Any questions that you've had about the tournament, the ones that you email about, oh, can you schedule my match earlier in the morning? Because I've got something I'm doing later in the day. The tournament director is responsible for the administration of the tournament, and they cannot make rulings or decisions regarding defaults or lateness on the court. Now, in level 7s, they have joint responsibility, tournament director and referee. So there they can, but in the ones that level 6 and above, they can not. So they have to call the referee and then describe what happened, and the referee will make um, assess the penalties. All right, so let's talk a little bit now about avoiding penalties. What can you do to actually avoid penalties? And what can you do so that you are not subject to suspension points or even being suspended for 3 months? All right, here's one of the things that I suggest. So before the tournament starts, you could actually get suspension before you even stepped on the tournament, before you did anything with the tournament. You've just entered the tournament. You entered 2 different tournaments because you think, oh, I might do this or I might do that. And then you forget that you've entered 2 tournaments and the registration dates close. So at that point, you are entered in 2 different tournaments when entries close. That you could get 4 suspension points for. Now, let's say you get selected in one, or you get selected in both because you forgot to withdraw from one of them. You get selected in both. And now you have to play one or the other because they're overlapping. You can't play in both. So you withdraw from the tournament, and it's not for illness, injury, or personal circumstance. So I guess some people would argue that maybe this is personal circumstance, but it would not be considered personal circumstance if we were aware of the fact that you're in 2 different tournaments. So you withdraw 4 suspension points. So You don't want to do that. So even before the tournament starts, pay attention to it. If you are planning to, if you are undecided about two tournaments and you enter both of them, make sure you withdraw from one of them before entries close. And before entries close, you can withdraw for any reason. You don't have to have, it does not have to be for illness, injury, or personal circumstance. All right. So here's another thing. You sign up for a tournament and you forget. This happens with younger players more, I think, than adult players. But the parent signs the child up for a tournament and something happens and they forget about it and you don't show up and you're not reachable. A default no-show is 5 suspension points. So this is another thing. If you enter a tournament, make sure that you remember that you are entered and you should show up for it. Or you withdraw before entries close, or withdraw if there's a reason for your not showing up. Something happened in your family, you need to attend to it. Withdraw from the tournament. Let them know that you're not going to be there. Second thing is to watch your behavior. And not only your behavior, but tell the people associated with you, the people who come to watch the match with you, people who bring you to the match, to watch their behavior. So the things that we see sometimes when we get grievances, bullying, intimidation, racist comments, all of these can end up getting suspension points. And this could be even before you've even played a match. You're out there, something happens, there's something going on, you say something, and you could get suspension points for that. You finish a match, you go home that evening, you put something on social media that says something bad, something derogatory about your opponent, you could get suspension points for that. So stay away from that kind of behavior. Don't do it. Don't even go there. All right, during the tournament, check in on time for your matches. Now, you won't get a suspension points for not checking in on time, but if you are defaulted for lateness, you will get one suspension point. So you're not on time, 15 minutes have passed, you've been defaulted, then you show up 25 minutes after your match start time. You've been defaulted, you're allowed to play in the back draw if you want to, but you get assessed a suspension point. An easy way to avoid that, be on time. Code violations, again, it's behavior. So if you can control your behavior, you're avoiding all those code violations and suspension points. Keep your racket in your hand. Get upset. I've seen some people whack the ball at the back fence. Usually that's okay, but sometimes you hit it hard and it goes, it bounces up, it bounces back, it goes over the fence, interrupts play on another court, it hits somebody. Even though you hit it at the back fence on the rebound, it hits somebody. Don't do it. Avoid doing anything that results in a code violation if the match was still in progress. So the match is over, you've lost, and you're really upset. And you go back to your bench and you smash your racket. You think, the match is over, nothing can happen now. I'm not going to get a code violation for that. But you will get suspension points because it's behavior that would have resulted in a code violation if the match was still in progress. But since the match is finished, can't give you a code violation and a point penalty or a game penalty or whatever you would have gotten. Instead, you get suspension points. You don't care about the match. You just, can't wait to get it over. I don't care. I don't want to, not interested in winning. I just want this over. You're not putting your best efforts. You could get 2 suspension points. You withdraw because you lost in the main draw and you're in the back draw now. And you don't want to play. So you just don't show up. suspension points. You get a code violation, you're arguing with the official, and the official says something to you, you argue back and forth. It's gone on for 3 minutes now. And the official says, let's play. You're not ready to play. You want to argue a bit more. So you keep on arguing for another 30 seconds. You get a code violation for delay of game and resulting suspension points. Parents, your child has just lost the match and you were observing the match and you think there was some behavior on the part of the other, your child's opponent, that was not good. So the players are coming off the court and you start saying something to the other player. You call them a cheat. Do not do that because the suspension points could accrue to your player. So these are some of the things that you can do to avoid penalties and avoid suspension points and avoid getting suspended from play for 3 months, 6 months. Hopefully never gets to the point where you're suspended over 12 months. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation. It's about 7:15. I think we have about 15 minutes. But before we get into the questions, I just wanted to introduce the rest of the junior competition team. And some of them are on this call, but Beth Workney manages the team. She's the senior manager. Tommy too, some of you might know him from some of the junior tournaments. Chris Samuel does all the net generation. The little kids love her. Trey Asbury, junior team tennis. So any of you having kids with playing in junior team tennis would know Trey. Lonnie Ray Green, who's the player development specialist, sets up all these player development camps and coaching camps for kids. I deal with officials and sportsmanship. And Stephen Morley, who is our junior competition coordinator and does everything. So that's the team. Our contact information is on the website if you need to reach us. And now I will turn it over to questions. Okay, and as I mentioned before, what I'd like you to do is to put any questions you have in the chat, and I will read them out and answer them. And if I can't answer them, I will get back to you on them. That's a question came up. Are you going to have a webinar like this for USTA adult league play? And we could do something like that. But just to answer your question, the league play also has a suspension point system that's very similar to what we use in tournaments. Some of the things that they assess suspension points for are slightly different because of the nature of team play and league play, but it follows the very same types of principles. You get 10 points during a 12-month period, you'll be suspended for 3 months. But if you think this would be something of interest to league players, I can work with my counterparts in the league department and get something like this for them as well. Okay, the comment in the chat says, again, related to the leagues, it says 2 women's teams got suspended for combo, and many of us want to understand how an entire team gets suspended. Yes, I can work with our counterparts in the leagues department, and maybe we can get something set up to talk about what uh, actions or what things you can do to get suspended in the leagues. We're at 7:20 now, and I don't see any more questions. So we do have the link to this webinar, to the slides, and we have a recording, so we will provide them to you. And I want to thank you all for attending. And I hope, like I said at the beginning, there was something in here that you learned and you can take away and use for your next time on court, either in the leagues or in tournaments, or if your children are playing tournaments.